UCB Life Issues with Paul Hammond.
And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. Now, they say it killed the cat, and very often it's seen as more of a negative about nosy people than a positive for increasing knowledge. And these days, it's more likely to turn up in comments around sexuality than spirituality. But what does it mean to be curious? Why are we so curious about the world? Is it just FOMO? Or is there a truth in us that sees the value of discovering what we do not know, of pushing the boundaries of understanding, of looking into the hidden depths or scaling the heights to see what's over the next hill? After all, if the eyes of the Lord roam to and fro over the earth to connect him with those whose hearts are devoted to him, is it any wonder that his creation has an urge to open the box and see how the cat is? But how do we, in faith, purity and compassion, balance that desire in a world where any whim can be explored online and where social media has made FOMO an international obsession? What is the difference between interest and curiosity? Because I'm a curious person. I want to know how the tech works. I want to see what is in the next valley. I want to know the joke, and I want to know how that theology holds up in everyday life. And is that really such a bad thing? After all, curiosity has brought us some of our great inventions, discovered new lands, and taken wise men to the feet of Jesus. So maybe it's time to reclaim the gift, model a better way than the YouTube rabbit hole, and follow the path out of the Shire. Dr Roger Bretherton is Associate Professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Lincoln. He is also the Director of Character Lab Lincoln, which conducts training, consultancy and research on character strengths interventions, and runs a course that espouses the value in this modern age of curiosity. So he might have an opinion or two. Roger, I'm curious. What is curiosity?
It's a good question, Paul, and a good introduction as well. Covered so many of the things that I'd be keen to talk about there. So I think we're going to talk about curiosity in the most basic way. We're talking about the ability to attend to our ongoing experience. So moment by moment, what is happening right now? So you could view that as a passion for learning. What insights am I gaining? What's going on around me? You could view it in some of the ways you've just talked about exploration. Maybe there's a sort of desire for adventure in curiosity. Some of the distinctions that psychologists have drawn about it, for example, they've talked about curiosity both being a state. In other words, any of us can at any moment go, oh, I'm curious about that, gain some interest, suddenly become fascinated by something. But it can also be a trait in the sense that some of us, just by nature of our personality, are more curious than others. So on average, people are different in the level of curiosity and interest and openness to experience that they have. And then there's sort of different types of curiosity as well. So some psychologists would talk about the difference between interest curiosity, which is, oh, I'm just interested in something, it's sort of idle kind of curiosity. Let's check that out. Let's see what I think of it. And another version of curiosity that they might call deprivation curiosity. Deprivation curiosity is, I don't know that and I really need to know. I really, really need to find out. And so that's the sort of domain we're talking about when we're talking about curiosity. It's about being attentive and interested in what's going on internally and externally at any given moment.
And given that there are some character types that are perhaps more driven by curiosity than others, what does it say about an individual? What does it reveal about an individual if they always have to know? If they were taking that technology apart and trying to put it back together, if they've got to understand the thinking behind it, even if they'll never apply it, they want to understand how algebra works, even if there's never going to be a use for it for the entire rest of their life. What does it say about that individual that they're like that?
I mean, when you're describing someone like that, you're describing someone who's quite obsessive, or really someone who sort of obsessively needs to know. In other words, they're almost pained by not knowing. And I would probably say that you're describing someone there, not so much who's curious, but who has a strong need for certainty, like a strong need to sort of bottom things out. Whereas when you look at people who are sort of curious by nature, so curious by disposition, if you like, they're more likely just to have an openness to experience. So rather than sort of closing down and not wanting to explore the world, they're more likely to get out and want to explore things. So someone who's curious by nature tends to be an exploratory kind of person. I mean, the weird thing about that is that we do seem to be able to map politics onto that. So people who are less curious tend to end up being more on the conservative side of politics. People who are more curious tend to end up a bit more on the progressive side of it. But it's not an absolute rule, but there's good research done on that idea.
So when we talk about curiosity and we talk about the way in which it impacts us and the way in which it frames us, because part of what we're going to talk about today is how faith fits into this. So is curiosity a trait that comes from the heart of God?
Oh, that is a good question. And not the way I would usually phrase it, but it's a really, really good one. And because I think when we're talking about God, and really when we're talking about human personality in that big way, we probably wouldn't want to land on one trait like curiosity. We'd want to open it up more than that. And I think the thing we would come to with God almost immediately is the idea of the Trinity being a relationship of love, a constant exchange of loving relationships between the member of the Trinity. But out of that, there's this sense of God having an outflowing of wanting to give himself away, whether that's in creation, whether it's in the incarnation, whether it's in Jesus coming to give himself and love and to die for us. And so if we were to define curiosity in the exploratory, adventurous way, then I think in the love of God and the way in which God initiates into the world in these wonderful kind of ways, I think we would say, yes, that's definitely part of God. And yes, perhaps it should be part of us too, that ability to sort of be self-forgetful and throw ourselves into life and give ourselves to others.
That's a really interesting way to define it, though, because you see, for me, I think there is this thought that if God, who is omniscient, omnipotent, etc., all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present, where nothing is hid from him, if there is still a part of him that wants to go out and reach out and give out of himself to make connection, it seems that curiosity is not just an idle thing, that actually it is a very productive emotion if channeled correctly.
Yeah, in the right way. And I guess that's why I say that when it comes to Christian faith and when it comes to God, I wouldn't want to talk about curiosity alone. I think it has to be balanced with lots of other virtues. We'd want to see faith, love, hope, gentleness, self-control. We want to see lots of other things there as well, in the context of which curiosity then feels like a good thing. Take away some of those things and it can go awry quite badly.
So we've hinted at some of this already, but curiosity then in the main, a good thing? It is good for us?
So I would say curiosity used in the right way, the evidence would suggest that it is very good for us as well. So, for example, in research that's been done on 27 million people across the world in every nation in the country that measures all their character strengths, curiosity consistently comes in the top 5 for producing well-being. So we know that people who register themselves as curious, are interested in their ongoing experience, are exploring the world in a proactive way, they are some of the happiest people alive. And not only that, we know that if we teach people to be curious, so if we put them through training courses that will go, just be interested in life, just look at what's around you. Think about taking a different route home from work today. Think about what new book you could read. Think about a deeper question you could ask for someone. We know that those people become happier as a result of doing that. So we know, if we were just to take well-being as one measure, we know that curiosity used in the optimal way can lead to well-being.
Okay. And as we're using the word well-being, and as you are a psychologist, I'm going to get you to define it, because I know what I think I mean by well-being, but within the context of you looking at this as a professional, what do you mean by that?
So well-being is measured in a number of different ways. So I guess I'm talking primarily about psychological well-being, which you might say good mental health. So about 20 years ago, psychology turned a corner in a movement called positive psychology, which meant that instead of being obsessed with illness and what goes wrong with us, it became more interested in well-being, what's good. And the interesting thing is that that's what led to the study of curiosity and character is, how do we begin to think about what these good qualities are in human beings? And out of that research basically comes a sort of a model of 5 paths to well-being. So it says people who experience the best well-being basically invest in 5 different areas. They have positive emotions. So for whatever reason, they feel joy, gratitude, hope, gladness, serenity, etc. Secondly, they're engaged in life. So day by day, they're sort of engaged in what they're doing. Thirdly, they have good relationships. Fourthly, they have good meaning. So they have a purpose to their life. And fifthly, they have a sense of accomplishment. So day by day, they end each day not by having won a Nobel Prize, but just feeling like, I'm pleased with what I did today. And those 5 things, positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, spell the acronym PERMA. So you'll find lots of psychologists talking about PERMA well-being, and that's what they mean. And that's what curiosity contributes. So each of those elements, to some extent, curiosity contributes to.
But there's for me, an interesting sort of twist to that, though, in the nature of my job, the nature of what I do, and I think even before I was doing this job, the nature of me as a person would incline me to want to look in the box. I wanted to look over the hill. I wanted to be aware of what was happening on the other side of the world. That curiosity to understand the nature of the world in which we live. The trouble is, all too often, that leads you to looking into dark places where man's inhumanity to man makes you think, what's the point? Despair of this. Goodness me, how could people be like this? And perhaps, year after year seeing that, it's not always a positive experience. So is there a flip side to it where, or is it, even doing that, because I'm answering my own question, aren't I? Because even doing that, I recognize that actually I do think I have a good, positive, PERMA well-being. So even if it takes you to see negative things and things that would make you despair, it is good for you.
So, I'm similar to you, Paul, in that way. So I worked in trauma for over a decade. So I sort of 10,000 hours of listening to people going through the most painful, difficult things you're ever likely to imagine. And I would also say with you that actually that was really worthwhile. So it might not have been a happy state that it put me in, but it was certainly definitely a very, very meaningful state and a very engaged state, and a state at the end of which I came out with a sense of accomplishment, even if the accomplishment was just, I've learned something there, learned something really important. I've been in contact with something that really, really matters and really is significant. Even if it doesn't necessarily include lots of positive emotions, you nevertheless feel that you come out of it with something that's significant and matters. If we wanted to, we could extend this into the research on parenting, for example, that says that being a parent when your kids are younger doesn't make you happy. But when you ask people later in life, they will say it was one of the most important things they ever did, because it's really important in terms of significance, meaning, development as a person. There's all kinds of rewards to it, but it doesn't necessarily, when you're sleep deprived or whatever, it doesn't help you in the early days,
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond, speaking this week to Dr. Roger Bretherton. Roger is Associate Professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Lincoln, and we are talking about curiosity and accepting that curiosity and a state of curiosity, a trait of curiosity, is good for our well-being. Is it also good for our spirituality? What is the importance and value of cultivating curiosity as a Christian?
It's a deep and important question, isn't it? I wonder if to begin with we should go the other way, though, because I think traditionally Christians have been quite suspicious of curiosity. I mean, I've heard sermons against curiosity, saying don't get into curiosity. St. Thomas Aquinas famously wrote about how you shouldn't be curious. Curiosity would lead you into sin. So I think we do have to acknowledge that bit before I start going, wouldn't it be great if we're all curious?
All right, let's start then. Why is that? I mean, why has the church, why have Christians traditionally been opposed to curiosity? You know, whether it be somebody looking through a telescope or somebody questioning a piece of dogma.
Yeah. So I think there's a few reasons. I think firstly, we don't like idle curiosity. And by idle curiosity, I mean curiosity that just seems to want to explore all kinds of things and find out about them without really having a reason or a good motive for doing that. So this is the equivalent that you were talking about. You know, you go on YouTube and before you know it, you've fallen down some terrible rabbit hole. And if you've done that for 2 hours, you're watching all kinds of things you probably shouldn't have watched because autoplay just took you from one thing to another. So I think that's the kind of curiosity I think that we should all be rightly suspicious of, be like, this probably isn't where I want to end up. The other thing that goes with curiosity is that it is disruptive of certainty. So if our Christian faith, we feel a bit insecure with it, or we feel like this absolutely has to be totally certain, we get nervous when it's questioned. Whereas I think a curious mindset says it's okay to question because anything that's true in the end will stand on its own. It will stand up to scrutiny, even if it takes a while for us to work out exactly how it does that. And so I think we're nervous about that. And then I think sometimes what happens is that people get more interested in new things, in novelty, than they are in what they already have. And so that's why I would say that the curiosity I'm talking about isn't about what's the new thing and how do we get into that. It's more about how do we look at what's already familiar to us and see new things, new dimensions. So I'm talking about a curiosity of depth, really, rather than a curiosity of breadth. It's kind of like, well, theologians have said, one theologian said of John's gospel, a child can paddle in it and an elephant can swim in it. And I think that's the kind of curiosity I'm talking about, is how do we go from a sort of childish, shallow, superficial understanding of our faith to a deep one? And I think it's very often inquiry and curiosity that takes us there.
And do you think that's perhaps the key value then for this appropriate cultivation of curiosity, not idle curiosity that disappears down the YouTube rabbit hole? Although, let's be honest, I've found more than a few good sermon illustrations by disappearing down a YouTube rabbit hole, but you do have to be wise about it. But it is an essential part of wanting to go deeper, to actually want to know a little more. How, when we develop appropriate curiosity, how does it change our view or affect our view of God, what he is doing in the world, how we are relating to him?
Do you know, if I'm really honest, I think it's a more accurate view of God, because I think if God is infinite, that we never get to the end of God. So even when Paul says, Paul the Apostle, not Paul the UCB radio presenter, when Paul says how high and wide and deep and long is the love of God, he's kind of saying there's quite a lot there to explore. There's quite a bit there we haven't really got to the end of. And I think curiosity is the approach that takes what I would call a sort of a dissatisfied satisfaction with everything we know about God. What we've discovered about God is wonderful. The way in which God has revealed himself to us is fantastic. But there's always that little bit of us that goes, I know there's more.
Yes.
And I know that probably to see that more, it will require something different from me, change from me, movement from me, a new perception from me. That probably if I'm going to see more of the love of God, I myself will have to become more loving in order so I can perceive it. And so my view of curiosity is it's that sort of, that area where we know there's more to be known, but we haven't explored it yet. And I think we should always have that as Christians. Even when we're reading scripture, we should go, this is beautiful, wonderful. I hold it to be true. I meditate upon it, but there's depths in it I haven't explored yet.
So how does that fit into the sort of certainty mentality that you find in some denominations, including, if I'm honest, often my own, that sort of I know that I know that I know, almost closed off to either being wrong or, and you know, the church history is full of the problems that led us into, but also perhaps closed off from considering that there might be more.
Yeah. I mean, I can just give my view on that. So I would say it just depends what you're saying. I know that I know that I know about. So I guess the way I would view it is, I know that I know that I know that the calling of Jesus on my life is absolutely trustworthy, that I can follow him, I can give my life to him, and I'm in good hands, and that he wishes my well-being, the well-being of the planet, and everything is good with him. But what I don't know is exactly where he's leading me. You know, I don't always know what comes next in my life, what's going to happen tomorrow, what tragedy, what joy might lie around the corner. I know that when I get there, he will be with me and he will be trustworthy, but I don't know exactly what he's going to lead me into quite next. So I guess my feeling is the certainty is in God, you know, that God is trustworthy, God is there, God is constant, God is faithful, absolutely certain. But then there's uncertainty in living in time, you know, the fact that, you know, we just don't know what's going to happen in the future. And the best way we can prepare for that is by attending to the quality of our relationship with God and with other people.
Is curiosity a good counterpoint, counterbalance, perhaps, to arrogance for Christians?
Yeah, so I think that there's an overlap between curiosity and humility. Yeah, I mean, we actually did research on this. Some of my students, we did research on trying to look at how people took in negative feedback about themselves. And what we discovered, I mean, basically, we went around campus and tried to find the most narcissistic, egocentric people we could find on campus. Who were they? Correct. Drama students. And so we measured their narcissism. And what we found that those who were the most egocentric were the ones who couldn't tolerate negative information about themselves. So I think the overlap between curiosity and humility is that sort of intellectual part of humility that says, like, there's stuff I don't know, about myself, then opens us up and allows us to be interested and wondering about what do I need to know? What else is out there? What are perhaps some of my negative traits or character issues that impact on other people? What is the negative piece of feedback I keep receiving over and over and over and over again, but think I can completely legitimately ignore? What are those things? And I think it's humility and curiosity together that allow us to take on that feedback and grow.
And where then, what are sort of other areas might developing a healthy curiosity? And as we've said several times during this, right, there is a difference between healthy and unhealthy curiosity. There are some things which we might be curious about, but it doesn't pay to open the box. There are some things which we can be curious about that can actually build strengths within us, and that is a positive road. And I suppose that's the same with all areas of life. Where can it help us? Not exclusively, but particularly as followers of Jesus, as people of faith, to nurture curiosity?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me start with some psychology, and then we'll come back to some biblical ideas in a moment. Because one of the most interesting areas of psychology around curiosity is the way in which curiosity builds good relationships with people. So there's been some really, really fascinating studies around if you are genuinely interested in other people in a curious way, in the appropriate way. So you're not overly intrusive, you're not asking questions they don't want to answer. Then what happens is that most people that you know will report a deeper relationship with you, a deeper connection, knowing you better, you knowing them better. And then the other thing that goes along with it is that we know that in people who are highly curious, that it also insulates them against the pains of rejection. So if they go up to someone who isn't interested in them, doesn't want to answer questions, doesn't want to be known, if you're someone who's curious, then generally, rather than judging that and withdrawing from it and going, "Oh, that was really painful," you just note that person didn't want to talk to me, and you're curious about why that might be, but you don't really draw very much of it. So there is a sense in which that curiosity relationally not only deepens our relationships, but helps us when our relationships go a bit wrong as well. It allows us to sort of ask questions about it.
You see, that's interesting because I can see, and I mean, I I do hesitate now because we've spoken before about the idea of humanity being logical or not. So I hesitate to use the word, but I can see the logic and it makes sense that if you are a curious person, if you are interested as well as interesting in a relationship, then that's going to add more depth. But I would have thought it would have been the other way around, that if I'm a curious person and I want to get to know people and I want to connect with people and I want to understand things and you say, no, I don't want to talk to you, devastation. It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, so I suppose, again, you're beginning to talk about people who might be obsessively curious or overusing of curious. In fact, this is one of the things I sometimes talk about, how sometimes curiosity and even kindness can become quite intrusive. So I've got really good friends in church who are meeting me on a Sunday morning and they'll say, how are you, Roger? And I'll be fine. And they say, no, how are you, Roger? I'll be like, fine, but no. How are you, Roger?
Yes.
And I'm thinking, well, I was fine until this conversation started. I don't know how I feel now.
What do you know? What have you discovered? Yeah.
Whereas an appropriate curiosity is interested in other people. And if those people pull away, I mean, this is what curiosity does, full stop, is that rather than dividing the world into good, bad, right, wrong, success, fail, whatever words you want to use, it's just interesting. I wonder what that was about. What was going on there?
Yeah.
And that's why it defends you against rejection, because instead of jumping to a conclusion, it's just open to a number of possibilities of why that person might have responded. Maybe they're not in a good place today. Maybe they don't like to talk. Maybe I'd interrupted another conversation. There could be a million, reasons why that person rejected me in that moment. And let's not land on that any of them have to be personalized to me.
So does curiosity make you less judgmental?
I think that's almost the definition of curiosity, in my opinion. It's one of the reasons why when psychologists have sort of scrabbled to find a definition for that state that some people would call mindfulness, other people would call it contemplation, but it's that ability to be in the present moment without judging. Some people have said one of the primary ways of viewing that is to talk about it as a state of curiosity, is that that ability to look at the present moment without leaping to a conclusion about it, and have a variety of different ways you could look at it. I would say you could almost define curiosity by saying it is the act of not judging and being interested.
Yes. So you may have a totally different point of view, totally different worldview, totally different life choices to me, and yet whilst I will still disagree with your choices, maybe even think that your choices are wrong and that are taking you in a direction that ultimately, maybe even eternally, is something that is bad for you, if I am a curious person, I will want to understand that, and I will also see how that can be of value to you, how you can make those choices, rather than just thinking you're foolish in the pathway that you're choosing.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So sometimes what will happen is a judgment will get between us and someone else in the relationship. So the moment I've judged you as wrong or bad or badly intended or lying or deceived, or, whatever judgment you want to make, lost, fallen, however you want to talk about it, I've kind of blocked my ability to be interested in you and to be curious about what your story is. And I think that missionally, this is really, really important, that rather than stopping at the point where we make a judgment, if we can move beyond that, what we can do is we can begin to say, why don't I aim to understand before I aim to be understood? Why don't I aim to try and just get to grips? Even if I don't agree, don't like what you've done, I nevertheless can get the story so that I understand why you've ended up where you are. I find myself in conversations with a lot of people who might call themselves de-churched maybe, or deconstructed or things like that. I find myself talking to a lot of people sort of in that kind of camp. And I'm always just curious about what happened here and what was the thing that happened? Why did you conclude that? Where did you end up? And I can genuinely ask those questions without judgment. And I have to say that 9 times out of 10, I come away just really understanding why they ended up where they ended up, even if I hope for something different for them. So very often I will put it to that. I'll say, I have a gentle hope that you kind of get back to that you find your way back into church or back to God or whatever, but it's not a condition of our friendship.
That's really important. And it also explains why you kind of advocate that Christians should be curious and should cultivate appropriate and healthy curiosity. You're listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm speaking this week to Dr. Roger Bretherton. Roger is Associate Professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Lincoln. He's also the Director of Character Lab Lincoln, and this idea of curiosity is a key part in one of the courses that he leads. So because I kind of took you off track there, I think, so let's dial back to what we were saying about where curiosity could help, because one of the notes that I've got from you in preparation for this talks about the idea that cultivating curiosity will help us with things like prayer, discipleship, Bible study, think I can see that one, mission. Can we just unpack some of those thoughts on top of what we've already said?
Yeah. I mean, I would link, they're not the same, but I would link curiosity to many of the passages in the New Testament that talk about seeking, that talk about what are you looking for. And that I have to apologize, I'm not a Greek scholar, so whenever I try and pronounce Greek words, I sound like I'm ordering furniture from IKEA or something like that. But if I try and pronounce it, it's the word zeteo. And zeteo is that word that's often is translated as seeking or desire or wanting or longing. And in John's gospel, it's the first question that Jesus asks anybody in John's gospel. What are you seeking? What are you looking for? What are you after? In Matthew's gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, this is the word that lies behind seek first the kingdom of God. Look after this thing. This is the thing you're looking out for and trying to find in the world. And then even right into the very definition of faith in Hebrews, where faith is defined as believing God and that those who seek him will be rewarded. I think this sort of idea of a seeking journey, of a searching journey, of a curious journey, if you like, into God, I think is really, really a fundamental part of Christian discipleship if it's going to be dynamic and if it's going to be a growing rather than a static experience. So I think for some people, they sort of join church and they tick that box and they feel like they never have to be curious or worry about, what they don't know ever again. Whereas I would go the other way and say that spiritual growth constantly involves this idea of perhaps not knowing and being aware that we don't know. We're uncertain about certain things.
So how does that unpack then in our day-to-day living? Because it's pretty clear that you think there's a place for curiosity. It's pretty clear that, as we've already said, that there is a balance between appropriate, healthy curiosity and that which will take us down roads that are in danger of undermining, I suppose, our faith and our experience of God, take us into sin, if we're going to use the old word for it. So how can we be intentionally curious in our everyday life in a way that we can be confident is going to be a positive experience? Because it's got to be more than just disciplining our use of YouTube.
Yeah, it sure has. So I think the first thing I would say is that I don't think at the outset, you can't always be sure that the road you're going down is a good way and that it's not a dead end. You know what I mean? You start asking a question about Christianity in some way, and sometimes you find actually this isn't leading me anywhere good. And I guess the way I would measure it would be that does it in the long term lead to fruit of the Spirit? So in the long term, is this leading me to be more loving, more gracious, kinder, more peaceful, more self-controlled? Is it leading in that direction, or is it leading me more towards being boastful, egotistical, trivializing things, etc.? And so, for example, I do meet some Christians who will sort of act as if they've kind of got to the next level, like they've got a knowledge that nobody else has got, and they will say things like, it's really hard at my level of discernment to be in church because I did all this searching and I found this new thing. I also find some Christians who talk as if they've discovered the new truth, I have to say that I'm very open to the sort of contemplative tradition, lots of which comes out the sort of Roman Catholic tradition. I'm very influenced and enjoy a lot of that. But occasionally I will meet some Christians who perhaps gone from maybe a more evangelical background to more of a contemplative thing, and they behave as if somehow they've discovered this new thing that nobody else know, and it's kind of superior to that other thing. So my feeling is there's a way of making that kind of curious journey that extends what you know now into perhaps something deeper, something bigger, without then judging where you've come from and saying that was wrong and now this is right. Saying actually that got me somewhere and it was really valuable and I'm thankful for it, I'm grateful for it. But I needed to expand it and explore so that my faith grew with me. I didn't end up, with the same faith at 50 that I had when I was 15 because, the clothes don't fit anymore, literally in my case.
As it is for all of us, I think. But I mean, there's a sense to that, isn't there? Because what I understood in my 20s as a dad of young children and my ability to see the roundness of life in that moment, very different to what I now see in my 60s as a granddad of young children. And it's right that I recognize that what was in the past was the building blocks of where I am now, not devalue them because I wouldn't be here without them.
Yeah. It's very easy to despise our foundations, isn't it?
Yes.
It's very easy to go, just because, that's sort of hidden now. I never needed it and it wasn't valuable at the time. And I think there is a sense in which we have to to be integrated people, we have to bring just as much grace to our past selves as we perhaps do to our current selves.
How do I take curiosity into prayer?
The way that works for me is that prayer is a process of exploring God, that our prayer life should deepen in the time that we know God. We should find it perhaps in different challenges and different ways that it works at different phases of our Christian life. But the way I see curiosity sort of working out in prayer, it's hard for me to talk about curiosity in prayer without also talking about love. So let me talk about kind of the love side of it. And let me sort of tell you my journey a little bit, is that gradually what I've moved to in prayer is that in prayer, things are deeper and the presence of God is more available and more intimate to us when we step ourselves out in love towards him than if we sit there simply being recipients of his love towards us. That there's almost this sense of when we in prayer move in love towards God, we expand our vision of who he is and what he's about. And in this sort of weird sort of Trinitarian way, as we love God, we find that we are being loved ourselves. And so it goes back to Paul's words to the Corinthians, doesn't it? Where he talks about how those who love God are known by God. And you think he's going to say those who love God know God, they know more about God. But actually, weirdly, what happens is the more you love God, the more deeply you have this experience of that deep constancy in knowing God. So weirdly, curiosity about God makes you deeper and deeper and deeper and more certain about his presence, his faithfulness, his constancy. And I think the more we push into God, the more we discover just how deep that love is.
And in seeing that moreness of God, I suppose there is, if we are willing to engage with the idea of being curious about him and gaining understanding, better understanding of his heart, chasing down the road that will never end of discovering all that there is to be found in him. As we do that, the more we see, the more that curiosity is piqued, the more the opportunity for us to go further and further and deeper and richer and richer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's the more we see of God, the more we know there is of God to see. I like what the Roman Catholic theologian Karl Rahner used to say, that we know we are in the place of spiritual growth when we realize that God is not as we thought he was.
Yes.
by which he doesn't mean suddenly God turns on a dime and is different. He means that we just turn a corner and there's another glimpse of God that we hadn't seen before. And I think that's why prayer in this life just begins to give us a tiny, tiny glimpse of what eternity will be like.
So a final thought from you then, in the wholeness of life, both emotional, spiritual, and maybe physical as well. What is the key point that causes you to encourage your students, those you get the opportunity to speak to, and us listening to you today, to nurture and to encourage curiosity in the way that we look at the world?
So by definition, because we're talking about curiosity, we've talked about this from the human side of things, haven't we? So we've talked about our desires, our exploration, our desire to have an adventure, and sometimes that adventure into God. But the other side of it that we haven't talked about quite so much, but which I found to be true, is that we all have this sort of strange desire for God in us. And when we start to follow it and to encounter God's presence, what we discover is there's another side to all this, which is that God is seeking us, God is after us, that the New Testament, Jesus's stories are full of God seeking, widows seeking, merchants seeking pearls, the list, shepherds seeking sheep, the list just goes on and on and on and on. And much of the time, the image is of a God who is seeking us, seeking us much more than we're seeking him. And I think that's weirdly where curiosity lands for me ultimately, is that I begin to realize that tiny desire, that tiny interest, that tiny bit of exploration into life to try and find God is infinitely mirrored in God himself as he seeks me. And when we become like him, we encounter him in that. And that's just the beginning of encountering love, faith, hope, gentleness, humility, many of the other character things we might talk about. But to begin with, I don't think we can do any better than begin with that question that Jesus asks in John's Gospel, which is, what is it that you're seeking? What do you want?
Many years ago, a friend of mine wrote a song that talked about how in God, as we journey with God, the more we learn, the more we find out how little we know. The incredible expanse of God is an incredible journey to take. The fact that he calls us to it, and the fact that when we start in curiosity to seek out the reality of him, the fact that we then discover that he has been seeking out, curious to be involved in a relationship with us, is a staggering thought. But then perhaps that explains why so often we are curious. Because if God is curious and keen to find relationship with us, of course we, his creation, are going to have an element of that in us. And in a world where people seek to answer that and cater to that by being curious about a whole range of things that so often seem to undermine that idea of growth and strength and security and confidence that we've been talking about today comes from appropriate curiosity. Well, perhaps it's all the more important that we not only find out what it is we believe, find out what it is in the heart of God, find out what there is in the depth of relationships and strength of human connection and fellowship and all that imagery that's in the Bible. Perhaps it's also important that we find out how to nurture good curiosity in our children, our grandchildren, our friends, our families, those we come into connection with. You've been listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. My guest this week is Dr. Roger Bretherton, Associate Professor of the School of Psychology at University of Lincoln and Director of Character Lab, Lincoln. It's been fascinating to talk to you today, Roger. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you also to Rachel, my producer, for this week. Why not join us next week for another Life Issues? Ta-da.